What if America was never discovered by Columbus? Would there still be a United States? Would Europe still rise to global power? Would entire civilizations survive? Tonight, I ask you to use your imagination, because we're about to explore an alternate path in history, one where Columbus never set foot in the Americas in 1492. So, dim the lights, and let's begin. 1492. The docks in Palos were still, the sails still folded, the water flat as polished glass. There had been talk, weeks of it, maybe months, about a voyage to the west, about islands and India and gold beyond the edge of the map. But in the end, there were no ships. The funds were pulled. The crown hesitated. A storm, a death, or simply another war in Granada. Historians would never agree. What mattered was that the voyage didn't happen. 3 ships that should have sailed west remained tied to Spanish wood, and a man who would have written his name into centuries returned to obscurity. Some say he died in debt. Some say he returned to Genoa, but no one remembered him the way they might have. And the Atlantic stayed quiet. For a while. In the courts of Spain, there were other concerns: a crumbling economy, whispers of heresy, the friction of recent conquest. The reconquest of Iberia had cost too much, in lives, coin, and patience. Isabella had other priorities. Ferdinand, too. The idea of sailing west to reach the east remained a curiosity, a theory for cartographers and monks. But without a charismatic sailor demanding ships and spreading maps across candlelit tables, there was no push. The ocean was too wide, too uncertain, and with India accessible around Africa, there was no rush to risk it. The few voices who still spoke of westward travel were told to wait. Just wait. And so they did. Decades passed that way. Maps remained unchanged. The world still ended in dragons and guesswork. The Atlantic remained the edge of everything, the deep, unknowable blue that swallowed ships and prayers. Stories of islands beyond the horizon faded into myth, just like the stories before them. The fishermen who worked the western shores of Europe had no reason to wonder what lay beyond, only that storms came fast and the waves rose high. Navigation improved, yes, but only for those tracing known paths. The Portuguese coasted down Africa. The Venetians tangled in the Mediterranean. But no one went west. Not far. Not yet. And so America remained unnamed, untouched, unseen. Its forests stood without foreign axes. Its rivers ran clean, feeding mouths that had never tasted bread. Civilizations grew and shifted. Some rose, some fell, but without interruption. The Inca built, the Mexica conquered, the Haudenosaunee convened. In the highlands and valleys of a continent still unknown to Europe, life continued on its own terms. No sails on the horizon, no steel, no disease, no crosses. Just more seasons. And in Spain, where one man once made promises no one remembered, the sea stayed where it was, far away and silent. 1493. In the corridors of power, no one spoke of new lands. There were no letters from across the sea, no breathless reports of distant islands or golden shores, no returning ships, no parades in Barcelona, no foreign parrots perched on velvet sleeves. The Atlantic, wide and gray, remained what it had always been, the end of the known. Merchants still traced their routes through the Mediterranean. Portuguese fleets hugged the African coast, inching slowly toward the Indian Ocean. But the Western Ocean remained still, unchallenged. There had been whispers the year before, rumors of a Genoese sailor, of some grand westward idea, but those whispers had died quietly. There were no discoveries, no announcements, just the same maps, the same doubts, the same silence. In Spain, the court moved on. The monarchs had other concerns: wars, debt, religious matters that demanded attention. The conversation about funding more voyages, if it happened at all, was brief and uneventful. There was nothing to show for the effort. No returns, no trade, no proof that anything had existed beyond the horizon. For those in power, the conclusion was simple. The Atlantic was not the future. It was a waste of coin and courage. The scholars and sailors who still entertained thoughts of the West were quietly ignored. Their maps were shelved. The Church, for its part, found no heresy in caution. And without news, the world simply remained as it was. Old, familiar, narrow. In the taverns and markets, no one asked about the sea. Fishermen spoke of currents, not continents. Sailors bragged of storms, not stars. The ports of the Atlantic coast watched ships leave, but only for the known routes: north to England, south to Africa. The idea of sailing into the unknown belonged to dreamers and drunks. And dreams, in a Europe still battered by plague and war, had little weight. Nations did not rise on possibilities. They rose on grain, on coin, on soldiers. So the Atlantic sat untouched, a horizon no one claimed, a silence no one questioned. The West remained myth, and myths did not fund expeditions. Meanwhile, across that untroubled ocean, the world turned. Seasons passed, rains fell, crops grew. In cities built of stone and ritual, children were born who would never hear the name Columbus. Rivers flowed where no European had yet stood. Forests whispered in languages no European tongue could speak. The sun rose on two continents, but only one knew of the other. The silence of 1493 was not loud. It did not echo. But it changed everything, not through action, but through absence. No letters arrived. No maps were updated. No names were written. And so the world waited, without knowing it was waiting at all. 1494. The world remained undivided. There were no papal lines drawn across parchment, no ink to mark what had not been touched. In Rome, the Holy See issued no proclamations. There was no need. Spain had brought nothing to the altar. No discoveries, no claims, no threats to Portuguese ambition. The sea beyond the west was still blank. Portugal continued its slow crawl around Africa, planting banners and building outposts, while Spain turned its eyes inward, consumed with debts, titles, and the long shadows of recent wars. Without lands to dispute, the crowns had no reason to quarrel. And so the meeting that might have redrawn the globe never took place. No treaty was signed, no globe was split. The world, as far as Europe knew, ended at the same old edges. The theologians were silent. The cartographers waited. The explorers, who might have vied for favor and fortune under new arrangements, found themselves idle. In another version of this year, they might have sailed under papal blessing, under flags emboldened by right and decree. But now they watched the ports and prayed for patronage that would not come. There were no legal battles for land unseen, no embassies sent to Lisbon or Madrid to define spheres of influence, no hurried negotiations in dark halls. The silence of the Atlantic extended into the courts and chancelleries. And silence does not negotiate. Without discoveries, there was nothing to own. Without ownership, there was nothing to fight over. The Atlantic remained free, not by law, but by absence. In the shadows of cathedrals, the church busied itself with other matters: heresies in the north, alliances in the south, the shifting sands of European power. The Pope had no need to mediate between Spain and Portugal, because nothing had happened to spark disagreement. The idea of dividing the unknown, of granting lands untouched by Christian foot, seemed premature, even absurd. There were whispers, of course, always whispers, that something still lay beyond. But the church did not draw lines around rumors. The parchment stayed clean. The authority to reshape the world lay dormant, unused. And so the idea of a new world remained just that, an idea, not a policy. Rome focused on what was already within reach. The rest could wait. And far away, on lands unclaimed, the world moved quietly. No flags were planted, no crosses erected. The people who lived there saw no change, heard no decree. Their skies remained theirs, their rivers ran uncharted, their gods unchallenged. In this year, there was no treaty, no conquest, no theft. The land was still its own. And in Europe, the kings and popes who might have laid claim to it never did. Because without sails, without maps, without news, there was simply nothing to divide. 1498. At the far edge of Africa, sails appeared where the ocean met the Indian horizon. After years of trial and failure, Portuguese ships had finally rounded the Cape of Good Hope and entered waters ruled not by speculation, but by ancient trade. Vasco da Gama, quiet and meticulous, stepped ashore in Calicut not as a conqueror, but as a guest, uninvited, uncertain, and watched. Yet his arrival marked a turning point. The route to India was now real. Europe had found a door into the markets of spices, silks, and wealth without crossing swords with the Ottomans or wandering into unknown Western waters. The gamble of the Atlantic no longer seemed necessary. The East, long imagined, had become reachable. And Portugal, careful and focused, tightened its grip on the only direction that now mattered. In Lisbon, the news arrived like prophecy fulfilled. The royal court celebrated not with parades, but with contracts. The merchants sharpened their pens, the crown drew new maps, and ships were ordered in bulk. The expedition had proven that the ocean was not endless, that the winds could be mastered and the coasts followed all the way to India. With the Atlantic to the west still shrouded in doubt and myth, attention turned fully east. Fortresses were planned, treaties negotiated. The king's name was etched into distant harbors. Unlike Spain, which had once flirted with westward fantasy and withdrawn in silence, Portugal now had evidence, and evidence was currency. The eastern route wasn't a dream, it was profit. The future lay with ports already thriving, cities already mapped, goods already priced. There was no need to invent a new world when the old one still had so much to offer. Back in Europe, the shift was immediate and strategic. No other power had managed such a feat. France remained inward, its ambitions stifled by borders and rivalries. England watched with envy but lacked the fleet. Spain, still licking its wounds from domestic unrest and failed adventures, found itself sidelined. Without a discovery of its own to champion, it fell into the role of spectator. The Atlantic, once imagined as the great unknown, returned to being a space of storms and superstition. It offered no spices, no trade, no certainty. There were no returning ships to prove otherwise, and with Portugal establishing footholds along the Indian coast, no crown dared invest in westward voyages with nothing to show. The energy of empire flowed south and east, not west. The balance of ambition had shifted with the monsoon winds, and still, across the sea untouched, the land waited. No white sails approached its shores, no charts marked its rivers. The empires that stood there, strong, complex, alive, had never heard the name da Gama. They continued to build, to trade, to rule. The Aztecs still climbed their temples, the Inca still ruled from their high cities, the nations of the north still moved with the seasons. The drums of their politics, their wars, their alliances, beat on in rhythms older than Europe's maps. In this year, the world had changed. A passage to the east had opened, and through it would flow wealth and war and religion. But none of it crossed the Atlantic. That sea remained untouched, and so did the worlds beyond it. For now. 1500. A Portuguese fleet, heavy with ambition and the salt of the Atlantic, was blown westward by accident. Pedro Alvarez Cabral, en route to India, found land where none was expected, green, humid, and vast. The coast stretched endlessly, and the trees stood thick with redwood and unknown birds. The men came ashore cautiously, planting a cross and a banner, carving names into bark. They met people, unclothed and unafraid, who offered food and observation, but no gold. There were no cities, no spices, no roads, just trees and wind and the press of wilderness. After a few days, Cabral turned east again, resuming the intended voyage around Africa. His logs marked the discovery, but his tone was quiet. This was not India. This was something else, and Portugal had no time for something else. In Lisbon, the news arrived without urgency. Another land, another coastline. But it held no ports, no silk, no cinnamon. The king's advisors studied the sketches and measurements, but the maps of the Indian Ocean still held more promise. Cabral had found something, certainly, but something undefined, something lacking. It was too far south, too overgrown, too empty in the ways that mattered to merchants and crowns. The wood might be useful. The coastline could offer shelter in storms. But no one proposed colonies. No one drafted laws. Portugal had made its choice years before. The path to India was the path forward. The Atlantic would remain a route, not a destination. Cabral's land was noted, labeled, and set aside. It had no name yet, only a color on a map and a memory in a journal. The men who might have sailed to follow him didn't. The docks remained quiet. No new ships were funded to explore the strange new coast. No priests were dispatched. No settlers. There were no arguments in court. No treaties. No royal decrees. The absence of reaction was louder than any proclamation, and so the land remained as it was. The people who lived there continued to live there. They saw no more sails, no flags, no sermons. Whatever impressions had been left by Cabral's brief appearance washed away with the tide. The Portuguese moved on, to India, to Malacca, to ports where coin and faith could be exchanged with clarity. The Atlantic, once again, swallowed its secret. And so the coast now known as Brazil remained untouched, unnamed, unclaimed. The forests grew, the rivers fed their banks, The people fished and sang and hunted without knowing that they had been found and then forgotten. For Portugal, it was a missed opportunity, though no one saw it that way at the time. It was a question not worth asking, a branch not worth following. In a world where every ship cost silver and every voyage needed certainty, the land across the Atlantic had none. It was too soon, too distant, too unfamiliar. And so history, that patient collector, marked the moment and moved on. The land remained, waiting. 1500 to 1520. For 2 full decades, Europe's gaze remained fixed on the East. The promise of India, of spices and ports and silk, consumed every court and council. Portugal led the way, its ships tracing long, careful lines down the coast of Africa and around its southern tip. Fortresses rose along unfamiliar shores. Alliances were struck with kings whose names were barely known in Europe. Trade routes were established, defended, and taxed. Pepper flowed into Lisbon. Cloves followed. Porcelain appeared on the tables of the rich, and the scent of cinnamon crept into cathedrals. The Indian Ocean became a European highway, and the wealth that trickled back from it fed maps, fleets, and ambition. There was no need to look west. The East was real. The East paid. Spain, which had once flirted with a different path, turned inward. Its empire remained local. Granada, Navarre, the long shadow of Aragon. Without discoveries of its own, it fell behind. The silence that had followed the failed western voyage of a Genoese sailor still lingered. No new explorers rose to replace him. The Atlantic remained unchanged, its mystery no longer compelling. In Seville and Barcelona, the shipyards built for the Mediterranean. The courts discussed Europe, Italy, the Pope. The East belonged to Portugal, and Spain had no answer to that. Without gold or territory beyond the sea, it relied on titles and tradition. There was no American dream, because there was no America. Not yet. France fought itself. England watched from the sidelines. The Holy Roman Empire writhed in its complexity. Across the continent, the focus was narrow. Asia had cities, armies, maps. America had none of these, at least none that could be proven. One forgotten coast discovered by accident did not spark conquest. No one had died for it. No one had claimed it. There was no glory in the Atlantic, no wars to be won there, no shrines to be built. Scholars still speculated, of course. Monks debated the limits of the world in candlelit libraries. A few obsessed over the lost voyage that never happened. But kings and merchants needed more than theory. They needed certainty. And so the ships went east, again and again. Across the ocean, untouched, a continent breathed. Civilizations expanded without interference. The Maya restructured their cities. The Mexica extended tribute networks across valleys and lakes. In the mountains, the Inca reorganized their empire, moving stone and labor in equal measure. In the forests of the north, confederacies formed, languages evolved, stories spread. No one came to interrupt. No one landed. The strange wooden ships that had once approached a distant shore did not return. The people remembered them as ghosts, or didn't remember them at all. The Atlantic remained a boundary, not a bridge. The world had two halves, and for 20 years, they spun in perfect ignorance of each other. Europe thought only of the East, and so the West was left alone. 1517. A monk in Wittenberg nailed a list to a door, and Europe began to fracture. What started as a protest became a movement, then a crisis, then a war of worlds. Martin Luther's theses spread faster than anyone expected, carried by print, voice, and resentment. In towns and villages, sermons turned sharper. In courts, loyalties shifted. The authority of Rome, long unquestioned in most of Christendom, now faced challenges from princes and peasants alike. Some saw the movement as liberation, others as heresy, but no one could ignore it. Faith, once a matter of habit and inheritance, became a battlefield, and the fire that began in the German states spread outward, slow at first, then with speed. Doctrine became a weapon. Belief became a line drawn in blood. And all across Europe, the noise of distant oceans was drowned out by arguments about grace and guilt. The kings responded as kings do, with calculation. Some embraced reform, seeing a chance to break free from the Pope's influence and claim new authority. Others condemned it, fearful of losing order, wealth, or their own salvation. Armies began to march not for land, but for souls. Cities were sacked for the wrong prayers. Neighbors turned against each other, not over borders but over scripture. The printing press poured out pamphlets like bullets, each page another front in a war of ideas. Universities split. Monasteries fell. Churches were painted over, stripped bare, or burned. And through it all, the question of the Atlantic, of lands unclaimed and peoples unseen, fell to the bottom of every scroll and ledger. Who could afford to dream of distant continents when the foundations of their own were cracking beneath them? Trade continued, yes, and ships still moved eastward under flags marked by crowns and crosses. But the fire of exploration dimmed. Where once a king might have listened to an ambitious sailor, now he listened to preachers, generals, and lawyers. The wealth of nations was measured in loyalty and canon, not speculation. The sea to the west remained unspoken. There was no energy for it, no unity to pursue it, no faith that such ventures would bring stability instead of further chaos. Even the church, once the greatest sponsor of discovery, turned inward. Rome scrambled to reassert control, to mend its influence with decrees and councils. The world beyond the horizon was silent, and Europe, in turn, had no time to listen. Across the ocean, the silence remained unchanged. No missionaries arrived, no ships, no doctrine. The people of the Americas heard no word of Luther, no echo of Rome, no threat of reformation or counter-reformation. They worshipped as they had before. The sun still rose, the maize still ripened, the rain still fell. Civilizations grew or faded by their own patterns, untouched by Europe's convulsions. In the long arc of history, these were years bought in blood. But across the sea they bought time. While Europe tore itself in two over the meaning of heaven, another world lived one more generation in peace, uncontacted, unconverted, uncolonized. For now. 1520 to 1550, Spain bled in Italy. The crowns of Europe played their long, bitter game across fields already soaked with centuries of struggle. The Italian wars pulled kingdoms into shifting alliances, where popes and emperors traded sides and cities like tokens. Spain, under Charles, tied itself to the Holy Roman Empire and marched again and again into the peninsula, first to defend, then to conquer, then simply to stay. French troops met them in Lombardy, in Naples, in Rome itself. Fortresses were built, razed, and rebuilt. Treaties were signed, broken, and ignored. The ambitions of Spain stretched not westward, toward forgotten oceans, but south and east across the Alps. Gold did not come from ships, but from taxes and blood. And while armies moved through Italy, no one asked what lay beyond the Atlantic. The silence of one sea was drowned in the noise of another. Portugal, meanwhile, turned ever deeper into the Indian Ocean. What had begun as cautious trading outposts became fortified networks. Goa, Malacca, Hormuz, names once foreign became part of Lisbon's identity. Soldiers followed merchants, and priests followed soldiers. Cannons guarded spice warehouses. Maps of the East grew crowded. Local rulers were bribed, threatened, or deposed. The Portuguese crown administered these territories with a mix of calculation and cruelty, more interested in access than control. The voyages were long, the risks enormous, but the profits were real. And with each successful journey, the idea of looking west faded further. Why gamble on myth when nutmeg was real? Why risk the unknown when pepper paid armies? The Atlantic remained a stretch of wind and waves, unworthy of attention. Portugal had found its empire. It did not need another. In Europe, the political and religious storms continued. The Reformation had fractured certainty, and the wars that followed cracked the map into sharper pieces. Spain became the sword of Catholicism. Its troops carried not just banners, but ideology. And every campaign demanded more men, more coin, more control. The Spanish crown, already stretched thin, leaned into what it could reach. Italy was a theater it could understand. The sea was useful only insofar as it moved armies from port to port. The New World, still undefined and unseen, had no role to play. If Spain remembered the failed plans of a Genoese dreamer, it did not say so. The ocean remained. So did the silence. And across that silence, in the vast lands still untouched, life unfolded in rhythms unchanged. The Inca expanded their roads and rituals. The Mexica enforced tribute and watched the heavens. The people of the forests, the plains, the mountains lived and governed as they always had. No galleons arrived. No strangers came to measure the land or its gods. The wars of Europe did not cross the ocean, and neither did its maps. For 30 years, the balance held. Spain was too busy. Portugal was too satisfied, and the Atlantic, wide and patient, kept its secret. 1550. The whispers began again. In ports and monasteries, in the corners of libraries and the backs of taverns, stories surfaced of strange birds, red woods, and coastlines farther west than the eye could follow. Sailors returning from long routes spoke of islands seen on the edge of storms, of silhouettes in fog that vanished with the wind. Some claimed to have found driftwood unlike any known tree. Others swore they had spoken to men who knew of coasts no map contained. None of it was proven. Nothing was written down formally. But the stories multiplied, carried from ship to ship, from mouth to ear. Cartographers drew gentle curves into the margins of the Atlantic, not bold lines, just shadows, possibilities. The world was still mostly known, but not entirely. And in that gap, curiosity began to stir again, quiet and uncertain. The rumors were not without cause. There were records, old ones often overlooked, of voyages that deviated from plan, of strange coastlines sighted in failing light. A few dusty scrolls spoke of land found during storms or by ships blown off course. The accuracy was suspect. The sources were questionable. But they existed, And in the slow tide of speculation, they found new readers. Scholars debated them. Princes listened politely, then changed the subject. No royal funding followed. No new ships were built. The age of grand expeditions had passed, or at least paused. Europe's attention remained elsewhere, on reformation, on fortresses, on trade routes already profitable. The Atlantic remained unexplored, not for lack of imagination, but for lack of incentive. Dreaming of distant lands was not enough. It had to pay. In Lisbon, in Seville, in Rouen, men gathered around maps and added nothing. The silence of the Western Sea had become institutionalized. It was accepted. The unknown was vast, yes, but it was also unproven. And the proven world already required so much management. Colonies in the East, uprisings at home, treaties that never lasted more than a generation. What ruler would risk men and silver on shadows? The merchants were cautious. The clergy had little interest in myth. Even the navigators, ever drawn to the edge of the map, found more reliable work guiding spice fleets and warships. The sea to the west remained open, but no one sailed it, at least not with purpose. The whispers remained whispers, and so, across the Atlantic, the world remained untouched. No sails came over the horizon. No new languages arrived. No one brought iron or disease or scripture. The peoples of the continent lived without knowing they were being imagined from afar. Without knowing their existence was a subject of debate. Their rivers still carried only fish. Their skies still belonged to birds. And their land, immense, varied, alive, remained unmeasured. The silence continued, not because no one believed the land existed, but because no one was yet ready to reach it. Not politically, not economically, not spiritually. It would take more than rumors to move ships again. It would take desperation, or opportunity, or both. But in 1550, the ships still stayed home. 1588. The sea favored England. The Spanish Armada, vast and confident, met storms and fire as it approached the Channel, and it did not return as it had come. English ships, smaller and faster, harassed from the flanks, while wind and chaos tore through Spanish formation. The ambition to bring England back under Catholic rule collapsed with every mast broken and hull scattered. What was meant to be a display of dominance became a floating graveyard. Spain, bruised and shaken, retreated. Its claim to mastery at sea was broken. But this was not just a military defeat. It was a turning point for prestige, for projection, for power. And unlike in the world we remember, there was no silver from overseas colonies to soften the loss. No gold caravels returning from distant lands. No empire propping up royal pride. Spain lost more than ships. It lost the illusion that it still led. At home, the defeat reverberated through court and country. The treasury, already thin from years of war and religious tension, now faced ruin. The dreams of expansion, already slowed by failure and distraction, turned to ash. There was no new world to compensate. No Peru, no Mexico, no plundered temples. The silence of the Atlantic returned, louder than ever. For decades, Spain had avoided the West not because it feared it, but because it chose other battles. And now, when it might have turned again to ocean and conquest, it no longer could. Its ships were crippled. Its morale was gone. Its king was aging, surrounded by advisors who offered prayers and regrets. The country that once considered itself the hand of God now counted debts. And the ocean, unmoved, waited still. England, by contrast, stood straighter. Victory brought pride, and with pride came ambition. But even now, it was ambition limited by means. The English crown had neither the navy nor the resources to build an empire overnight. The merchants wanted trade, not war. The nobles wanted land, not ocean. And though victory had come, it did not yet spark immediate expansion. There were whispers of opportunity, of lands still unclaimed, of routes still open. But these were spoken quietly, at the edges of maps and the ends of conversations. The Western Ocean still loomed as a gamble, not a guarantee. And the war with Spain, while decisive at sea, did not resolve the deeper uncertainties. Europe remained volatile. Faith still split kingdoms. The western frontier remained what it had always been, mysterious, vast, and untapped. Beyond that frontier, the world remained untouched. The forests of the continent heard nothing of naval battles. The mountains did not echo with the clash of flags. Civilizations still rose and fell by their own hands. The Mexica still watched the sky for signs. The Inca still moved armies through stone corridors. The Algonquin still followed the seasons. No one knew that Spain had tried and failed to reach across the sea. No one knew that England had taken its place on the water. The continents remained strangers. The Atlantic remained empty. And history, which often hinges on conquests and maps, here hinged on absence. In the year 1588, one empire fell at sea, but another had not yet begun to rise. 1595 to 1600, in the counting houses of London, among ledgers and maps stained with ink and sweat, something began to shift. The defeat of Spain had not only humbled a rival, it had cleared a path. The seas, once tightly watched and jealously guarded, now felt open in a way they hadn't before. And with Spain's grip weakened and Portugal committed to the east, English merchants began to look west with new eyes. They had heard the rumors. Coastlines glimpsed in storms, driftwood strange to Europe's forests, birds with colors no Englishman could name. But more than mystery, they saw margin. If there was land, there might be timber. If there were rivers, there might be fish. If there were people, there might be trade. The goal was not glory, it was profit. But even that was enough to bring the ships back into discussion. Plans formed slowly. There were no grand speeches, no royal charters announced with fanfare. Instead, it was letters passed quietly between companies, meetings in the upper rooms of taverns, quiet investments made by men who could afford to risk only part of their fortune. Navigation had improved. Astrolabes and charts had grown more precise. And though the Atlantic was still feared, it was no longer unknown. English fishing vessels had pushed farther west than ever before, chasing cod across the fog-bound banks. Some captains reported sightings, strange lands low on the horizon, the air changing before landfall, birds that did not migrate. These accounts, once ignored, now returned to the table. Perhaps there was something there. Not gold, maybe, but something useful. And use was the beginning of purpose. The crown watched, but did not lead. Elizabeth's court had no appetite for colonial gambles, but it did not forbid them either. The wounds of European wars had yet to heal. The treasury remained cautious, but merchants had learned to act without waiting for royal blessing. Private ventures took form under neutral flags, or none at all. Ships were bought quietly. Crews assembled with vague promises of exploration and fishing. No one said colonization. No one said empire. But the word expedition returned to conversation. The West was no longer dismissed. It was simply delayed. And now, perhaps, it was time to see what lay beyond the weather, beyond the stories, beyond the silence that had lasted a century. The ships did not yet sail, but their sails were being stitched, and across the sea, the world prepared in its own way, without knowing it, without needing to. The coastlines that had once seen a single foreign ship, and no others since, remained quiet. The people who lived there spoke of the stars, the winds, the spirits of the land. They did not look east. They had no need to. But the patterns were changing. The birds flew differently. The seasons shifted in subtle ways. Something old, buried in the rhythm of the world, began to stir. Not prophecy, not fear, just the edge of a ripple, long delayed. Back in England, anchors waited to be lifted, and in the West, the wind carried no names. Not yet. 1600. After centuries of silence, a sail appeared on the horizon. It was not the first ship to cross the Atlantic, but it was the first to do so with intent, with planning, and with the quiet weight of a nation behind it. The English expedition was modest. No grand fleet, no drums of conquest, no banners fluttering with royal insignia. Just a few ships, weathered and slow, guided by merchants and mariners with more curiosity than certainty. Their maps were imprecise, their charts unfinished, but the pull westward had finally overcome hesitation. What they found, after weeks at sea, was not gold or ruin, but land. Dense forests, winding rivers, shorelines that seemed to stretch forever. The coast of North America, unnamed and unclaimed, greeted them not with resistance but with stillness. The silence was not empty. It was waiting. The landing was cautious. The English did not march inland or raise flags. They stepped ashore as guests, unsure whether they were seen or welcome. Smoke from distant fires hinted at life beyond the trees, but for days, no people came. The crew gathered fresh water, examined plants, and listened to the forest speak in ways they could not understand. The expedition leaders kept notes of soil, of weather, of strange birdsong, and the marks of tools on tree trunks. They knew they were not the first humans here. That truth was clear in every path worn through the brush, in every fish trap built along the stream. But they were the first from their world, the first from England, the first, they hoped, of many. And in that hope was the seed of change, not yet empire, not yet settlement, but contact. And contact always leads somewhere. In time, the locals came, not many, and not at once. A group of men appeared across a clearing one morning, watching without approaching. Their posture was calm, not fearful. The English raised open hands, offered trinkets, metal buttons, glass beads, folded cloth. The men did not respond, then vanished into the trees. The next day, others arrived. This time, they came closer. There were no shared words, only gestures and patience. A meal was exchanged. Fish for bread, roots for salt. No agreements, no alliances. Just a moment of recognition that two peoples stood before one another, both real, both curious. The English marveled at the strangers' tools, their clothing, their ease in the land. The locals examined the ships from a distance, as if unsure whether they were alive or built. Neither side knew what to expect, but no blood was shed. That mattered. The expedition did not stay. It had not come to conquer, only to see. The ships left before the winter deepened, returning to England with sketches, samples, and stories. They spoke of vast forests, of calm shores, of people who were neither hostile nor eager. They spoke of potential, and potential, in the minds of those who read their reports, quickly turned into opportunity. The silence of the Atlantic had been broken, not shattered, not yet filled with noise, but broken just enough to let a single voice through. A voice that said, "It is there. It is real. And it does not belong to anyone. Yet." In 1600, the world tilted slightly on its axis, not in thunder, not in fire, but in footsteps on a quiet shore, and the knowledge that they would not be the last. 1605. The second expedition did not come in search of discovery. It came to answer a question. Was there something worth returning for? Not riches, not conquest, but continuity. Could the cautious exchanges of that first encounter grow into something more? Could two worlds, so long apart, find ways to speak, not through language but through trade? The English ships returned to the same coastline they had touched years before. They found it little changed. The same salt-heavy wind, the same slow movement of trees against the horizon, the same silence waiting to be broken. But this time, the silence did not last. Before a week had passed, the local people returned. This time, they came quickly, and this time they carried goods of their own. The first trades were simple: tools for food, knives for furs, iron pots for woven cloth. No one wrote treaties, but rules formed naturally. Exchanges happened in open ground. Both sides observed closely. English goods were unlike anything the local tribes had seen. Hard metals, sharp edges, glass, salt in perfect grains. In return, the English received pelts, dried meat, carved bone, medicines they could not name but quickly valued. Trust was not immediate, but curiosity pushed both sides forward. There were no illusions of equality. Each side wondered what the other might want, what it might take. But there was no violence. Not here. Not yet. The coast remained a place of caution, but also of possibility. Something new was being built, tentatively, with pauses, with missteps. But it was being built. The English learned quickly. They studied how the locals fished, how they moved through forests, how they read the sky. They realized that their hosts were not primitives. They were specialists in a world the English barely understood. Entire social systems governed the exchange of goods, the movement of families, the honoring of territory. The English, unused to such forms, made mistakes, but some learned to listen. They saw that what seemed wild had its own deep order. They saw that the people they met were not waiting to be discovered. They had already built lives rich in complexity. The English offered tools and cloth. The locals offered knowledge. Over time, those who returned to England brought back not just goods, but stories. And stories, once told, are difficult to contain. Word spread. The land across the ocean was not empty. It was alive. And it would not remain untouched. By the end of the year, regular exchanges had begun. Simple posts were established, shelters of wood and sailcloth where goods could be left and collected. No forts, no churches, no fences, just temporary stations in a land still unnamed. The English avoided moving inland. They knew they were tolerated, not embraced. They knew that every gesture of peace could become a misunderstanding. But they stayed long enough to return again and again. The coastlines began to show signs of change. The glint of metal where once there was only stone. The smell of English tobacco mingling with native herbs. The changes were small, barely visible if you squinted. But history had turned its face. In 1605, for the first time in 100 years, the Atlantic was not a border. It was a bridge. Fragile, unfinished, but real. 1615. The tents became walls. The shelters of sailcloth gave way to structures of timber, and the makeshift camps hardened into permanent footholds. They were not towns, not yet. No churches rang bells, no streets bore names. But these places had doors that locked, stockpiles that stayed through winter, and men who no longer planned to sail back. The first English factories, trading posts built not to conquer but to stay, stood close to the shoreline, never far from the rivers that fed them and the forests that watched in silence. They had no fortifications beyond what the wilderness demanded: storage sheds, lookout perches, and a fire that never went out. They were there to trade and to remain. For the first time since sails touched the Atlantic wind, English hands built with the intention of return. The locals noticed. Some watched from a distance, while others came closer. Relations were not uniform. One village welcomed trade and sent hunters bearing skins. Another sent no one and watched from treetops. The English, now more practiced, moved cautiously. They brought not only goods but patterns, trading schedules, measurements, prices. They recorded what was exchanged and with whom. Some even began to learn local dialects, creating hybrid forms of speech that were part necessity, part survival. In return, the tribes adapted too. Certain communities began to specialize in trade goods most valued by the foreigners: dense pelts, medicinal roots, rare stones. What began as sporadic exchange now became routine, seasonal, predictable. The coast became a zone of contact, where neither side ruled, but both had something to gain. In England, reports of stability were met with cautious optimism. Investors who once rolled dice now saw ledgers. A shipment of pelts returned on time. Barrels of fish were salted and stored. A new kind of wood, stronger, lighter, was tested by shipbuilders in Plymouth. These weren't the riches of empire, but they were proof. Proof that the Western venture could be real, that it could grow. More ships were dispatched, this time with skilled carpenters, masons, even clerks. They didn't build fortresses, but they built permanence. And permanence changes expectations. These posts were still small, a few dozen men, a few buildings. But they had weight. They had names now, names given by the English, unrecognized by the land. Yet there they stood, month after month, unburned, unchallenged, still trading. And deeper inland, something shifted. The goods brought by the English traveled beyond the coast. Metal blades replaced stone ones in some hunting parties. Wool appeared on shoulders where before there was fur. A small mirror became the prized possession of a family 100 miles from where it was traded. Not all embraced the change. Some tribes warned of dependence. Others saw opportunity. But the line had been crossed. The coast was no longer a mystery, and neither were its visitors. And those visitors, though still few, now had homes. In 1615, the Atlantic became more than a route. It became a corridor. Narrow, tentative, alive. And on both sides, people began to prepare not for departure, but for return. Again and again. 1630. The coast no longer belonged to silence. For 3 decades, the English had returned again and again, their ships tracing familiar paths, their hands building what was once unthinkable, settlements that endured. Trade had become routine, and the local peoples, while not conquered, had learned to navigate the new presence with both caution and calculation. But the Atlantic wind carried news farther than intention. Across the channel, others listened. The French merchants, pragmatic and patient, had watched the English reports with growing interest. And the Dutch, already veterans of sea trade and rivals to both Spain and England, saw not mystery but margin. There were still no empires on the western shore, just outposts, whispers, and trade routes waiting to harden into habit. That was enough. The French and the Dutch did not ask permission. They came. The land was still wide. The forests did not end. And so the newcomers found space between what the English had claimed and what remained untouched. French ships touched northern shores, where the water was colder and the rivers narrower, but teeming with fur-bearing animals. They brought beads, cloth, and iron. But more than that, they brought patience. Unlike their southern conquests in other timelines, here they had no orders to convert, no mandates to dominate. The tribes they met spoke of English trade and showed iron blades as proof. The French did not challenge. They offered better prices. In some places, that was enough. Relationships formed quickly, not through treaties, but through mutual interest. A French post rose near a bend in a river, then another, then a third. Not fortified, not walled, just present, just constant. To the south, the Dutch landed with different energy. They moved swiftly, favoring harbors that could become ports, mouths of rivers that could carry goods deep inland. Their ships were larger, their crews more businesslike. They brought not only trade goods, but systems, ledgers, contracts, schedules. The Dutch did not charm. They negotiated. And when negotiations failed, they simply moved down the coast and tried again. Their settlements grew quickly, each built like a market before it was ever a village. They welcomed all tribes, asked few questions, and made clear what they offered: consistency. Their goods were cheap, their arrival predictable. And in a world that was still unsure whether the Europeans would stay, the Dutch offered a strange comfort. They always returned, always with something to trade. The English noticed. Their posts were no longer alone. The competition was quiet, but unmistakable. Prices shifted, alliances strained. Some tribes who had traded exclusively with the English now entertained other partners. A bundle of beaver pelts might go north instead of east. A supply of salt might arrive later than promised. The land was not being fought over, not yet, but it was being measured differently. Trade became a triangle, not a line. Goods flowed in strange new patterns, and as the posts multiplied, so too did the misunderstandings. A promise made to one tribe now had consequences in 3 directions. A missed delivery could ripple across hundreds of miles. And still, no empire had declared ownership. No war had been fought. But the land began to feel narrower, the opportunities more urgent. In 1630, the coast of North America became not a mystery, but a marketplace. And marketplaces do not remain still for long. 1650. It did not come with a scream or a fire. It came quietly, on the breath, in sweat, in a single cough that echoed too long in the corners of a lodge. The ships that had brought mirrors, blades, and wool now carried something far less visible and far more lasting. The diseases arrived not in war, but in trade, carried by men who felt no fever, by goods exchanged hand to hand, by the invisible threads that tied two continents together more tightly with every season. At first, it was just a strange illness. A child who did not wake. A hunter who could no longer walk. Villages whispered about spirits, about curses, about the ground rejecting its people. But soon the whispers turned to silence, because there were fewer voices left to carry them. Not all communities suffered equally. Some, deeper inland, heard only rumors and saw only strangers become ghosts. Others, especially along the coasts, where trade was strongest, were hollowed in months. Entire lineages disappeared. Ceremonies were held with fewer drums. Councils sat with too many empty seats. The elders who remembered the times before the sails passed quickly, and with them knowledge. In many places, it was the old who died first, leaving the young to guess at what once was. Some tribes fractured, others merged. Refugees from broken communities wandered inland, seeking safety or meaning. There were no clear patterns. One river village thrived, while another downstream vanished. It wasn't war, and so there was no enemy to fight. It wasn't famine, and so there was no harvest to save. It was just breath, and it changed everything. But it did not end everything. This time, the devastation was not total. The century of delay, those lost decades in which America had remained untouched, had bought something precious: time. Time for resistance to form, slow and subtle. Time for stories to spread. Time for the trade networks to grow more cautious. By 1650, many coastal communities had already adjusted how they engaged with foreigners. Some kept distance. Others quarantined trade goods. Many had begun to understand that something came with the cloth and the beads, something that took without asking. A few had learned, without knowing the science, that isolation sometimes meant survival. And so, when the worst came, it came unevenly. Some nations bent. Others stood. Some vanished. Others re-emerged, reshaped. Smaller, but not broken. In the settlements of the English, French, and Dutch, the response was mixed. Some traders saw their partners disappear and simply moved on, seeking new alliances. Others grieved, having lived for years among the very people now gone. A few sent word home, describing empty villages with more awe than sorrow. But the most perceptive realized something deeper. The land had not emptied. It had endured. Slowly, painfully, but still. The civilizations of the continent did not collapse. Their cities remained. Their languages continued. Their stories, interrupted but not erased, were spoken again by the children of survivors. The scars would last generations. But scars are not the end of the body. And in 1650, while Europe debated profit and provinces, the people of the Americas mourned, rebuilt, and remembered. They had survived the first great test not of war, but of contact. And survival now meant they had a future still to shape. 1670. The storm had passed, but not forgotten. The people who remained, scarred, scattered, reformed, no longer saw the European presence as novelty. By now, the ships were expected. The seasons were marked not only by harvests and snow, but by sails on the horizon. Trade was no longer a cautious dance. It had become an institution. And in the quiet spaces between epidemics, alliances, and slow settlement, something more profound took shape. A shift not just in power, but in practice. Some nations, once wary of outside tools, now built their lives around them. Metal, once rare and ceremonial, became everyday. A hatchet passed from hand to hand, not as a gift, but as a tool. A musket, carefully repaired for 10 winters, became a badge of leadership. Foreign tools did not erase tradition. They were absorbed into it. It wasn't uniform. Some tribes rejected European goods entirely, turning away from the coast to preserve older ways. Others dabbled, trading for glass beads while keeping their tools of stone and bone. But in certain places, especially where trade routes crossed, where rivers met the sea, a deeper transformation emerged. Communities reorganized their economies around foreign exchange. Hunters brought more than needed, not for survival, but for value. Crops once grown for family use now filled woven baskets bound for the shoreline. Even time itself shifted. Some councils began marking years by the number of ships that arrived, or the weight of metal received. Trade had become rhythm, and rhythm changes the body. It changes how people think about distance, surplus, even peace. For peace, after all, made trade possible. And trade, more than faith or conquest, was now the true frontier. The most visible changes came in the tools of survival. Iron knives lasted longer. Copper kettles boiled faster. Guns, even when slow and heavy, changed how disputes were settled, not just between tribes and settlers, but among native nations themselves. Some began crafting their own shot, repairing flintlocks with improvised parts. Others copied European agriculture, planting in rows, rotating fields, even storing grain in new ways. They still hunted, still fished, still lived by the land. But the land itself was beginning to carry new shapes. Fields widened, trails became roads, caches became storehouses. What had once been a seasonal stop was now a permanent settlement. And where one group thrived, another adapted. Knowledge, too, became a kind of currency. How to use the tools, how to repair them, how to speak the broken tongue of the Dutch or the smoother words of the French. And yet, none of this meant surrender. These were not conquered lands. The people here did not see themselves as subjects of distant kings. They were partners, intermediaries, opportunists, survivors. They chose what to take and what to refuse. They buried foreign cloth with their dead, but did not pray to foreign gods. They built new homes with iron nails but kept the same fires burning. Even as the Europeans mapped the coasts and carved names into places already known, they failed to grasp the depth of adaptation. The people of the continent were not becoming Europeans. They were becoming something new, something hybrid, intentional, enduring. By 1670, the land was no longer divided between old and new worlds. It was something else entirely. A place where trade shaped identity, where resilience took unfamiliar forms, and where the future, though unclear, was increasingly shared. Not equally, not peacefully, but undeniably. 1690. The land was no longer just a wilderness waiting to be claimed. It was a lattice of relationships, traded, tested, and slowly formalized. The first settlements had matured into towns, and the temporary factories had hardened into stone. The coast, once unknown, was now a chain of outposts and names, English harbors, Dutch trading hubs, French river ports. But beyond the timber walls and the language of trade, something deeper had begun to form. Not just exchange, not just presence, but understanding. And from understanding, necessity. The settlers had come with the dream of ownership, but the land was not empty, and the people who lived here had their own structures, networks of kinship, law, alliance. So where conquest had failed or never tried, cooperation grew in its place. Fragile, negotiated, incomplete, but real. And from it emerged a new word on foreign lips: alliance. These alliances were not born from charity or friendship. They came from need. The settlers, still few in number, could not survive alone. They needed guides through forests, interpreters at council fires, safe passage through rival lands. And the native nations, those who had survived disease and displacement, understood the settlers were not leaving. So if they were to remain, they might as well be useful. Some tribes saw partnership as a way to balance against enemies. Others sought access to trade goods more directly. Still others hoped to guide the newcomers toward shared prosperity, or at least shared restraint. The treaties that followed were not like those to come in later centuries. These were local, specific, practical. Agreements over hunting territory, shared defense, trade protection. The signatures, when they came, were often marked by both ink and smoke. Not all Europeans were eager. Many settlers still carried old-world arrogance, believing the land was theirs by divine right. But their leaders, more pragmatic, saw what power looked like in this unfamiliar place. Power was not in muskets or forts, but in knowledge. Who knew the rivers? Who could cross tribal lines? Who could call 100 warriors to a field? And so diplomats emerged. Some native, some European, some both. People who could speak 2 languages, or 3. People who understood that peace could be more valuable than territory, that a shared enemy could bind together those with nothing else in common. By the close of the century, there were names known on both sides of the cultural divide. Leaders who could walk between worlds, wearing a beaded necklace in the morning and a linen coat in the evening. Of course, not all alliances held. Some were betrayed. Others collapsed under pressure. But enough remained. Enough to shape the next generation. Children were born who saw white faces not as invaders, but as neighbors. Some grew up speaking mixed dialects, knowing both the sound of a drum and the crack of a gun. Ceremonies were held that blended symbols. Disputes were settled not by force, but by agreed-upon voices. And through it all, the land changed, not through flag-raising or forced labor, but through mutual entanglement. The settlers were still outnumbered. The native nations were still sovereign. But now, for the first time, they were woven together, in trade, in war, in alliance. And in 1690, that weaving was no longer accidental. It was the shape of things to come. 1710. The forest still stretched far, and the rivers still ran clean, but the land no longer belonged to one world. It was now a meeting point, a hinge between languages, customs, and systems. And with each passing year, the web of relationships grew heavier. Trade had become the heartbeat of the continent's eastern coast, predictable, expected, and deeply interdependent. But the weight of that trade, the endless flow of furs and iron, corn and powder, needed structure. Agreements drawn hastily over fires or scratched into wood no longer sufficed. Too many disputes, too many misunderstandings, too many goods gone missing or miscounted. The alliances of the previous decades had held, but now they strained under the pressure of growth. And so something new emerged, not out of idealism, but out of exhaustion. The first councils, formed not to govern nations, but to manage what truly mattered: exchange. The idea did not come from Europe. It was born in the space between customs, where English schedules met native memory and Dutch ledgers clashed with oral tradition. These councils were small at first: 2 chiefs and a magistrate, a trader and a sachem, a French officer and a Wendat elder, sitting together on logs, in barns, or under open sky. There were no official rules, only shared interests. Keep the trade flowing, resolve disputes quickly, avoid blood. And it worked. When one tribe accused another of poaching pelts meant for a French partner, the council heard the case. When an English storehouse shorted grain to a native village, the complaint was voiced across the same fire. These were not courts, there were no jails, but there was power in being heard, and more importantly, in being listened to by the other side. Over time, these gatherings took on shape. Meeting places were chosen not for their size but for their neutrality. Islands in rivers, clearings near crossroads, old ceremonial sites repurposed for new negotiation. There were interpreters, sometimes 2 or 3 layers deep. Tobacco was shared before business. Disputes were told as stories, with pauses for reflection and moments for silence. Everyone knew who funded which settlement, who controlled which creek or trail, who had broken which promise 2 winters ago. The councils became memory, not just a forum for trade, but a living archive of relationships. And slowly, their influence grew. Traders sought their blessing before expanding. Chiefs deferred to their rulings when border questions arose. Even European captains, once dismissive, learned to wait for the council's word before acting. No empire had intended this. No crown had signed a charter for shared governance between native nations and settlers. But the council was a child of necessity, not of decree. It functioned because it had to, and in doing so, it laid the foundation for something unprecedented. For the first time, European settlers and indigenous peoples began to co-manage land, not as equals in power, but as partners in outcome. Boundaries were drawn not by flag or force, but by voice. Trade routes became corridors of shared responsibility. Missteps were recorded not in ledgers, but in memory. And memory held weight. In 1710, there were still wars. There was still suspicion. But there was also something more. A model. A beginning. A place where 2 worlds, so long divided, learned not to merge but to meet, again and again around the circle, with voices raised not in conquest, but in council. 1730. The rivers had carried more than goods for a long time now. They had carried language, rumor, agreement, and contradiction. From the Great Lakes to the southern deltas, waterways were no longer just physical arteries, they were political ones. Along their banks stood not just villages or forts, but a patchwork of influence. English merchants with Dutch contracts, native leagues with French support, councils made of both, and boundaries redrawn each spring depending on the tides of diplomacy. The councils had multiplied, solidified, and proven themselves not just as tools for trade, but as instruments of peace. But now something more ambitious began to take shape. Not a treaty, not a charter, an idea. Quiet at first, and mostly unspoken, that this fragile cooperation might be more than temporary, that it could be something permanent, that it could be united. The term was first used offhandedly, in a letter, in a council, in a moment of exasperation. A Mohawk speaker gestured downriver and said, through a Dutch interpreter, "We govern here, and you govern there, but the river governs both." That phrase stuck. The river governs both. Soon it appeared in trade logs, in meeting minutes, even in tavern songs sung along the coast. French fur captains and native farmers repeated it alike, and by winter, someone gave it a name: the River Union. It wasn't a country, not yet. It wasn't even a federation. But it was something larger than any one settlement, something more coordinated than the scattered treaties of the past. It was an understanding that if the river carried their trade, then it also carried their fate. And fate needed order. Discussions followed, some formal, others whispered. Could these councils form something lasting? Could a Mohican sachem and a British envoy sit beneath the same roof and write laws? Not colonial laws, not tribal laws, shared ones. The thought was dangerous to some, especially European governors who feared loss of control. But others, especially those born in the new lands, saw only potential. The children of mixed homes, of bilingual households, of lives spent walking both paths, now stood at the edge of something new. They proposed not a conquest of culture, but a braid of it, a body of shared law, rooted in trade, in memory, in water. If alliances had worked for 20 years, why not 50? If a shared council could solve a border dispute, could it not also plan a harvest or defend a road? By the end of the year, the first declarations were drawn, not binding, not yet, but shared. A rough outline of what the River Union might become, a federation of communities, each with voice and vote, an agreement that no trade would pass without mutual approval, a promise that no single nation, European or native, would claim the land alone. The languages varied, the interpretations shifted, but the current was clear. Something was changing. Not quickly, not cleanly, but irreversibly. The continent was not becoming Europe. It was becoming itself, a place where compromise was a skill, not a failure, where treaties outlasted flags, and where the river, as always, flowed forward, carrying with it not just goods, but the future. In 1730, the River Union was only an idea, but it was an idea whose time had come. 1750. The crates still came in by ship, cloth, steel, rum, ink, but when they landed, something had changed. It wasn't the goods themselves, or the captains who brought them, or the traders who took their tally. It was the paper. New stamps, new fees, a new signature from across the sea. Britain had decided that the colonies, scattered along the coast, entangled with native councils, stubbornly self-regulating, were no longer just partners in trade. They were subjects. Revenue would now flow not just through the rivers, but across the ocean, straight into the coffers of a crown that had never set foot on this soil. London saw a growing economy, rich forests, expanding settlements, and they wanted a share. Not through diplomacy, but decree. Taxes on ink, taxes on sugar, taxes on glass. Small amounts on paper, but vast in meaning. No one had asked the people here. And that, more than anything, was the problem. The River Union was still young, unofficial, uneven, more dream than government. But it had teeth and memory. The people here, native and settler alike, remembered what happened when distant kings made decisions for unfamiliar lands. So when the British tax collectors arrived with ledgers and seals, they found cold stares and closed doors. At first, it was disorganized. One harbor refusing a shipment, another delaying paperwork, a council postponing payments. But soon, the resistance found shape. The councils met. Traders passed word from one river bend to another. Elders remembered older boycotts, older protests, and taught the younger generation how to hold firm. The boycott was not loud. It was quiet, relentless. Shipments went unopened, contracts unrenewed. Even native traders, many of whom had once viewed British goods as lifelines, joined the refusal. The taxes were not shared, and so the goods stayed docked. Britain responded as empires always did, first with disbelief, then with anger. Governors were instructed to enforce compliance. Soldiers were sent, not in great numbers, but enough to remind the colonies who claimed control. But this wasn't the same land Britain thought it governed. The River Union was not a single colony with a single voice. It was a network of agreements, half spoken and half written, held together not by force but familiarity. Where one town cracked, another held. Where one council wavered, a neighboring one lent support. The British underestimated the patience of the people here. They expected rebellion, perhaps even violence, something they could crush with redcoats and muskets. Instead, they found refusal. Months passed, then a year. The taxes went unpaid, trade slowed, but life did not. What emerged from the boycott was not chaos, but clarity. For the first time, the River Union acted not just in trade or peace, but in principle. The question was no longer about tariffs or stamps. It was about voice. Who had the right to govern this land? Who had earned that right? The British Crown had gold and guns, but it lacked presence. It lacked roots. And in 1750, the people of the River Union began to understand that maybe they didn't need kings. Maybe they didn't need permission. Maybe the rivers and the voices that flowed beside them could speak for themselves. The boycott was never declared officially, but it spread like frost over water, slow, silent, and impossible to ignore. 1765. The boycott had not faded, and neither had the questions it left behind. If Britain no longer spoke for the people of the River Union, then who did? Not just the settlers, whose loyalties split between the old country and the new land. Not just the native nations, whose councils had kept peace for decades, but knew the future would demand more than peacekeeping. The land was now a weave too tight to separate. Too many shared roads, too many marriages, too many winters survived together. And so, for the first time, something more formal was proposed. Not a treaty, not a rebellion, a council. Not of tribes alone, not of colonies alone, but both. A body that could listen and speak in equal measure, made of those who had lived through the shaping of this new world, who knew both its dangers and its potential. A true, shared council. The idea didn't come from a speech or a governor's desk. It emerged from conversations, over fires, in storehouses, at river crossings. A Wendat elder spoke of the Great Council Fire, where nations once met to solve disputes. A Quaker merchant spoke of town meetings and shared decisions. A Dutch trader translated between them, not just in language but in concept. Slowly, the outlines began to form. Each province, each major nation, each established settlement would send someone. Not a warrior, not a king, but a voice. They would meet once per season. They would rotate locations, so no place held too much sway. They would speak in 2 languages, then 3, then more. And they would decide, not by vote, but by agreement. Not always quickly, but always together. The first gathering took place under canvas, beside a fork in the river where trade routes met and no side held claim. There were no uniforms, no crowns, just coats, robes, feathers, and hands weathered by trade and toil. They sat in a circle. They spoke, some with force, others with hesitation. A French settler asked how land titles would be handled. A native elder asked how water access would be guaranteed. An English speaker proposed an official calendar. A woman from the Haudenosaunee nation asked why there were so few women in the tent. The meeting lasted 3 days. They drafted no laws. They passed no decrees. But when they left, something had shifted. They had returned not just with stories, but with a vision, a model, something to build on. And build they did. Over the next years, the council grew, not in grandeur, but in relevance. When a dispute broke out over iron shipments in the south, the council arbitrated. When an outbreak of disease threatened an entire valley, the council organized aid. When British envoys returned to demand taxes, the council answered, not with muskets, but with a united voice. It was slow, it was flawed, but it was theirs. A council formed not by conquest, but cooperation. It had no army, no fortress, only memory and trust. But in a land built by rivers, those were strong foundations. 1765 marked no revolution, but it marked something deeper. A beginning of a government not imposed from across the sea, but grown from the soil, the water, and the people who walked between both. 1775. The letters crossed the ocean slowly, sealed in wax and carried in the holds of merchant ships. They were written in careful hands, some in London offices, others in wooden houses along the rivers, where snow curled under the doors and the talk never stopped. These were not declarations, not yet. These were requests, proposals, veiled warnings. The councils of the River Union, now meeting regularly and drawing ever closer together, had grown restless, not in anger, but in structure. They were managing their own trade, defending their own borders, coordinating grain shipments during failed harvests. So when another royal tax was announced, this one on river tolls, there was no outrage, just exhaustion. They wrote back. "This land governs itself," one letter began. "We remain loyal in name but not in silence." The tone was formal, polite, but unmistakably firm. In London, the responses were mixed. Some ministers still believed the colonies were scattered and weak, held together by accidents of geography and nothing more. Others had started to worry. Reports from the Americas showed a sophistication that could not be ignored. Coordinated boycotts, diplomatic visits between native nations and colonial towns, trade policies enforced without violence. The River Union was not a rebellion. It was a rival government, quietly rising without a shot. And so a decision was made. Not war, not yet, but negotiation. Britain would entertain talks, not with the whole River Union, which it refused to recognize, but with individual colonies. divide them, test their resolve, offer slight autonomy in exchange for continued loyalty, make promises, delay decisions, hold control by holding the conversation. But the strategy backfired. The letters reached the colonies, and the offers were tempting. Local control over tariffs, official recognition of councils, limited legislative independence. Some colonial officials were ready to accept, but the council met again, this time in the winter, on packed snow beneath tall pine, and the discussion turned sharp. "What does it mean to be almost free?" one elder asked. "Is partial voice enough for those who bear full burden?" A British-born merchant, whose children spoke both English and Mohawk, stood and said, "They offer us tools we built ourselves." It was not a call to arms. It was a call to clarity. If the River Union was already acting as a government, did it need permission to continue, or simply the will to stop asking? In the months that followed, the talks with London continued, but now with conditions. The colonies no longer negotiated alone. They coordinated. They compared letters. They held joint councils. A list of shared demands began to circulate. Calls for full legislative authority, recognition of native partners as sovereign entities, shared control of river access, and the right to refuse British troops. London bristled. These were not negotiations. They were ultimatums. And still, the River Union remained calm. There were no uprisings, no red flags, just a steady refusal to be ruled by those who did not understand the land. By the end of the year, the conversations had not ended, but the meaning had changed. What began as a plea for compromise had become a rehearsal for independence, not shouted, not signed, but lived every day along the water. 1785. The last redcoat boarded his ship in the mist, his boots caked in the riverbank's thick mud, his orders folded tight in a pouch that smelled faintly of mildew and ink. No farewell ceremony, no last command. Just silence, and the creak of wet wood underfoot. The British garrison at Port Halley, one of the few still staffed, had received its recall 3 months earlier. The message from London had been brief. Withdraw, no further reinforcement, preserve dignity. After years of cold negotiations, boycotts, and slow refusal, the Crown had made its final calculation. These lands were no longer worth the weight of control. The River Union, never officially acknowledged, had become impossible to ignore. Britain could not defeat what would not fight. It could not command what no longer listened. And so it left. The River Union did not celebrate. There were no parades, no declarations, no flags raised in triumph. The news traveled not with bells but with barges. Traders passed word downriver. Elders repeated it in council circles. "They are gone," they said, "and we remain." It had been years since anyone truly feared a British return. But absence made the truth unavoidable. There were no more taxes to resist, no more decrees to petition, no foreign judges arriving to preside. For the first time, the land was what it appeared to be, governed by those who walked it. The shift was not in ceremony, but in rhythm. Council sessions grew longer, more structured. Trade records became standardized. Disputes once deferred to London were now handled internally, with translators working side by side. European settlers and native leaders, once cautious allies, now found themselves as equals, though not always comfortably so. Trust was still patchy, but shared need held more than shared blood ever could. In London, the silence was noted but not mourned. The empire turned its eye to India, to Africa, to places where gold still glittered and resistance could be met with force. America, this tangle of rivers, languages, and ideas, was no longer a colony, but neither was it yet a country. In diplomatic circles, officials referred to it obliquely: the river settlements, the trade league, those cooperative provinces. No embassy was sent, no recognition given, but ships from Bristol quietly resumed trade. Merchants signed contracts with river union brokers. Insurance firms wrote policies for river cargo. The reality had shifted. Britain did not say independent, but it acted accordingly. And in diplomacy, action often speaks louder than proclamation. By year's end, the councils of the River Union met to mark the moment, not to declare a nation, but to acknowledge a condition. They were not yet unified, not yet federal, but they were alone and together. What began decades earlier as an alliance of necessity had become the framework for a state. They did not name it, not yet. But in private letters, in meeting notes, in ledger margins, a term began to appear more frequently: de facto borders, de facto governance, de facto independence. It was not legal, not enshrined, but it was real as the tides, as real as the soil. In 1785, without war, without revolution, the River Union stood on its own. Not because it broke away, but because it no longer needed permission to stay. 1790. Snow melted slowly that year, and the river ran high. The barges came earlier than expected, and with them came the delegates, 37 in total, wrapped in wool and oilcloth, carrying satchels of parchment and weeks' worth of arguments. They arrived from the marshes of the south, from the forested plateaus of the north, from towns with Dutch roofs and villages with longhouse shadows. No two spoke the same dialect. No two shared the same past. But all of them knew what the last 5 years had meant: independence without form, authority without agreement, trade without regulation. And yet it had held, just barely. Now it had to become something more. The council had called them to one place for one purpose: to write something. Not a constitution, not a treaty, but a charter. A temporary guide for a permanent shift. A shared framework, built by many hands, but with just enough structure to keep those hands from pulling in opposite directions. The draft was not elegant. It could not be. Too many contradictions had to be flattened into compromise. Each province wanted something different. Some demanded control over their forests, others over their ports. The native nations, firm in their autonomy, insisted on equal status, not as guests, but as co-founders. The Dutch settlements wanted trade protections. The English wanted legal precedent. The French communities pushed for language rights. The southern provinces asked for looser ties, fearing domination by northern voices. Every clause came with a counterclause. Every agreement hid a warning. But beneath the noise, something real took shape. The charter would not name a capital. It would not crown a leader. Instead, it would form a rotating council, a circle of provinces, meeting quarterly in different locations. It would grant each member equal vote, but require consensus for major decisions. It would allow local customs to persist, but bind trade and defense into collective responsibility. The most difficult passage was Article 5, territory. How could land be governed collectively when ownership was so tangled, between old European grants, indigenous stewardship, communal farms, and trading company claims. After days of deadlock, they struck a path forward. Land would be administered in trust. No private owner could override collective agreements. Disputes would be resolved not in courts, but in open council, with all parties present and heard. And in return, the Union would ensure protection of boundaries, of trade routes, of watersheds. It was not tidy, but it was workable. And more importantly, it was different. A government not based on dominion, but negotiation, not on conquest, but continuity. It would not be fast, it would not be efficient, but it might survive. When the delegates signed, there were no trumpets, only the scratching of ink in a cold hall lit by morning sun. They returned to their boats not as victors, but as stewards. They carried copies of the charter to every village, town, and meeting lodge across the rivers. Some questioned it, some ignored it. But slowly, the effects became visible. Trade disputes dropped. Grain shipments moved on time. The Circle of Provinces met again that summer, then again in the fall. And each time, the discussions grew more fluent. The temporary charter had no preamble, no grand language, just a title: Agreement for the Shared Administration of Territories and Waters. But in practice, it was more than policy. It was a declaration of intent. That this land, shaped by many rivers and many peoples, would not drift. It would row together. 1805. The rivers ran deeper than borders, and the land had begun to listen. Out west, beyond the old Dutch mills and the English brick churches, beyond the familiar tongues of the coastal towns, there were valleys that echoed with new names, some drawn from native dialects, others whispered by French trappers or carved into wood by runaway indentured families who had settled where no map yet reached. These places had watched the River Union from afar, not with fear nor envy, but with quiet calculation. For years, they had remained apart, choosing caution over affiliation. But the stories traveled upstream faster than taxes ever had. Stories of fairness, of shared grain reserves in famine years, of village disputes resolved without weapons, of caravans moving without being robbed, of the Circle of Provinces growing not in weight, but in balance. And so, one by one, envoys began to appear at council meetings, not asking for aid, not begging for recognition, but asking how to join. It began in Timberford, a settlement known more for its smoked fish than for any political ambition. The elders there had kept their distance for decades, wary of losing their customs to some Eastern bureaucracy. But after 3 hard winters, during which River Union traders had delivered seed grain and iron tools without price or pressure, the community held a vote. It was unanimous. They sent a delegation of 5 to the Spring Council. No demands, no pride, just a message: we are ready. They were welcomed not as inferiors but as equals, seated at the same table, given the same voice. No border needed to be redrawn, no tribute needed to be paid. Only the charter had to be signed, and the responsibilities accepted. When they returned, they brought with them new tools. Yes, but also new respect. Other regions took notice. That same year, 3 more territories requested admission. One of them was Willow Bay, where 2 languages were spoken and neither fluently. Another was Alder Point, where French settlers had lived alongside Algonquin families for generations without ever naming their alliance. And the third was a stretch of riverland known simply as the Long Bend, where no one had ever drawn a formal border, but where trade posts had grown up naturally like reeds on the shore. Each of them sent representatives to the circle. Each of them brought concerns, local traditions, clan hierarchies, fishing rights, but none of them brought hostility. The council debated for weeks, not on whether to accept them, but how best to adapt the rotating meeting schedule, the trade tax matrix, the joint patrol routes. The structure bent, but it did not break. The charter had room. By autumn, the circle of provinces had grown by nearly a third, not through conquest, not through annexation, but by invitation. The newcomers were asked to contribute to shared grain reserves, to participate in the seasonal census, to uphold the roads and bridges between communities. In return, they received representation, protection, access to the union's markets, and, perhaps most valuable of all, a seat at the table where rules were made. The river routes widened. Translation became a full-time profession. Meeting halls grew more crowded, more layered with dialects and perspectives. And yet, amid all this, the founding ideal held that no province would be forced to join and no voice would be drowned out. It was not perfect. No government ever is. But it was a shape that made space instead of erasing it. And as the year turned, more eyes turned east, not to bow, but to ask if there was still room. There was. 1815. The hall was cold, though the windows stood open. The circle had convened for its spring meeting in a stone structure once used as a granary, now draped with tapestries from 5 different regions. Delegates stood at attention, not because of tradition, but because the speaker at the center had called them to stillness, not with force, but with a kind of careful gravity. He was old, but not frail. His voice held the rhythm of river speech, with that lilt you hear when someone has crossed too many territories to sound like just one. His scroll trembled only slightly in his hands, and when he unrolled it, silence fell like a weighted cloth. He read aloud a proposal, not for a new policy, not for a war, not even for a tax. He read aloud a name for what they had become. The provinces of Colombia, he said, and the room did not gasp, but leaned. The name was not unfamiliar. Poets had used it in the margins of ballads. Children had heard it in bedtime stories where rivers spoke and canoes did not sink. Traders scrawled it in notebooks when mapping routes too new to be marked. It had lived in whispers, in songs, in sketches. But it had never been spoken in this room, never put forward as a name to bind them. Until now. The old man did not explain it with grandeur. He said only that they were no longer a river union, nor merely provinces. They were more than a corridor for goods, more than a compact of survival. What had begun as shared grain and joint patrols had become a thing that had shape, memory, and will. Colombia, he said, came from the rivers and the soil, from the spaces between nations, not above them. A name not of dominion, but of presence. A land that spoke many tongues but had begun to dream one story. Debate followed, as it always did. Some rejected it. Too mythic, too poetic, too American in origin, they said. Others countered that a name with roots in legend was better than one pulled from the tongue of any one province. Colombia, they argued, was a name no one truly owned, only carried. The Algonquin representatives asked how it would be rendered in their language. The French delegates wanted to know how it would sound in song. The Dutch farmers laughed and said they'd still call it the Bend and be done with it. But even they agreed. The idea had weight. No vote was taken that day. The circle never moved quickly. But by the summer meeting, something strange had begun to happen. Letters arrived addressed to the Columbia provinces. Trade ledgers bore the name Port of Columbia. Children carved CU into school desks where RU used to be. The name, once spoken, refused to fade. It became a kind of gravity, not enforced, but felt. A name passed from hand to hand like a coin, each touch smoothing its edge. By the end of the year, the circle still had not made it official. There was no decree, no proclamation. But when the harvest tallies were read in autumn, the speaker paused only once, smiled, and said, "For the record of Columbia." No one corrected him. No one protested. In that moment, it was done. The charter would not change yet. The documents would still say River Union for a time, but something older than parchment had been rewritten. And in fireside meetings, in storm-beaten huts, in halls with leaky roofs and long benches, people spoke it without blinking. Columbia. Not a place you conquer, a place you build. Together. 1820. The meetings had moved indoors again, not because the weather was poor, but because the weight of what was being discussed demanded walls. The old charter had served its purpose. For 3 decades, it had held the provinces together, barely. It had outlined trade routes, settled disputes over river crossings, established common weights for grain, and even allowed for rotational leadership. But it had never truly spoken for all. It had been written in haste, by a handful of merchants and translators, using borrowed laws from Britain, France, and a dozen tribes. Now, Columbia had grown beyond those compromises. The rivers still flowed, but the current had changed. New provinces had joined, old boundaries had faded, and the people, especially those whose ancestors had lived on this land before ink touched parchment, were no longer content to be mentioned only in footnotes. They wanted a voice, a real one. The proposal did not come as a thunderclap. It arrived like early snow, expected, quiet, and hard to ignore. At the Winter Council, a delegate from the Western Ridge, speaking in a slow and deliberate cadence, simply asked, "When will we write something new?" And no one laughed. That spring, the Circle voted not on a new constitution, but on the formation of a writing council. 12 members were chosen, 3 from the founding eastern provinces, 3 from the newer settlements, 3 from long-established native nations, and 3 from mixed regions where languages and laws had already merged. It was the first time such a body had existed, not just representation, participation. These 12 did not meet in secret. They did not hide behind gates. They traveled constantly, moving from council to council, hosting fireside discussions, visiting farming collectives, speaking in longhouses and churches and open marketplaces. Their mission was not just to write, it was to listen. What they heard was not agreement. The voices were too many, too layered. But what they heard was truth. In the South, elders asked that the seasonal traditions of the Lenape be protected in law. In the northern hills, farmers demanded that the right to land ownership never be severed from the land's care. In the inland river valleys, trappers and traders wanted assurance that decisions made on the coast wouldn't be imposed on those who lived 2 weeks' journey away. And across all territories, from the white clappered towns of the east to the birch lodges of the north, one demand echoed: that this new document speak not of conquest or control, but of stewardship, not of hierarchy, but of relation. The writing council kept notes in 3 languages, then 4, then 7. They used charcoal on bark when paper ran short. And when their draft began to take shape, it was not framed in clauses. It was framed in covenants. By autumn, the early drafts were circulating, not through printers, but through hands. Scribbled, translated, argued over. Some called it too idealistic. Others said it wasn't bold enough. But nearly all agreed on one thing. It felt different. It wasn't the voice of one people pretending to represent all. It was a chorus, not always in harmony, but in rhythm. When the circle met again, and the writing council read the preamble aloud, no one clapped, no one cheered. The room was still. It was the silence of weight being acknowledged. A pause before something larger begins. They had not yet signed it. They had not yet voted. But they had crossed a line they could not uncross. A new shape of governance was coming, and this time it would not be written in borrowed ink. It would be carved from the voices of Colombia itself. 1830. The chamber was quiet, though it was full. Delegates lined the benches in rough semicircles, their coats dusted with road and river. Some wore feathers, others wool. A few held beads in their hands like talismans, not for luck, but for focus. In the center, a single desk held the final draft. Not a scroll, not a relic, just paper. Brown-edged from use, but whole. The Constitution had taken 10 years, 3 councils, and the slow-burning agreement of dozens of cultures to exist. Now it was ready. No grand ceremony had been planned. No cannon, no parade. Just signatures, one after the other, in inks made from oak gall and soot. Some wrote in looping European letters. Others carved their names in symbols older than any crown. When it was done, the desk was not surrounded by applause. It was surrounded by breath, as if everyone had been holding it. The document began without flourish. No divine right, no royal authority. Only this, that the peoples of the continent, native and settler, river-born and mountain-raised, chose to bind themselves to a shared future. A future not enforced by arms, but entrusted to law. The provinces were recognized, each with their customs, their languages, their courts. But above them stood something new, a federation, not of dominance, but of alignment. It had been hard-won. For some, the term constitution felt too European, for others, too vague. But the text made clear what it was: a living agreement, revisable by consent, accountable to the people, and written in plain speech, so no man, woman, or child would need translation to understand it. The name came at the end, not as a title, but as a consequence. And let this be the united governance of the provinces of Colombia. The name had already lived a life before this, in letters, in trade stamps, in school books. But now it was legal, recognized, rooted. The United Provinces of Colombia, no longer just a loose chain of cooperatives, no longer a federation in theory only. The name was chosen not because it erased difference, but because it offered a frame big enough to hold it. The word Colombia carried no monarch, no god, only a river and the idea of crossing. It meant transit, flow, connection. For many, it also meant healing, an identity not stolen, but grown. Delegates from indigenous nations spoke first that evening, standing not in gratitude, but in assertion. They reminded the room that unity must always be earned, not presumed, that this new structure must never speak over the voices that built it. And so, in the Charter's final clause, a council of shared origin was established, half native, half settler, tasked with ensuring cultural and legal parity, from education to land law. The ink dried slowly. Some pages had to be signed again. But by morning, it was real. Riders left at dawn for every province, carrying copies sealed in hide and wax. Word spread not in proclamations, but in candles lit in windows, in small toasts over breakfast, in prayers muttered in half a dozen tongues. There was no capital, no seat of power, only a shape that had formed itself slowly, like sediment building into land. And now that land had a name that fit it. Not an empire, not a kingdom, a union. The United Provinces of Colombia, a place where the past had not been erased, only finally, cautiously shared. It began with paper, but it didn't stay there. The name moved. It traveled faster than any messenger, across valleys, rivers, borders. In market stalls and council huts, in coastal ports and forest villages, people began to say it out loud, not with ceremony, but with certainty. Colombia, not just an agreement, not just a hope, a country now, with borders drawn not by empire, but by compromise. With voices that had once fought each other, now meeting in the same room. Something had shifted. Not suddenly, but permanently. Recognition did not come with trumpets, but it came. Slowly, carefully. The first letters from European courts addressed the River Union no longer as the settlements, but as a provisional republic. Trade representatives from the Netherlands and Denmark arrived bearing new contracts. Maps were redrawn. Colombia no longer appeared as a dotted coast, but as a shaded landmass with a name that refused to fade with rain. A seal was carved, a provisional flag, a circle of rivers entwined with stars, was raised in coastal towns. It was simple, but it meant something. A child born under that symbol would be raised not just as a settler or a tribesman, but as a Colombian. And that word, too, Colombian, was more than just ink on parchment. It carried within it centuries of contradiction and compromise. This was not a nation born from a single crown or from conquest alone. It was an uneasy, layered inheritance. European tongues spoken beside native ones, English law tempered by tribal consensus. The General Assembly included voices that no European parliament had ever heard. Elders from forest nations, emissaries from river confederacies, men and women whose ancestors had never seen an ocean. Not every voice carried equal weight. Not every treaty was perfect. But they were there, and they were heard. On the ground, life changed slowly. A farmer still woke to till his plot. A merchant still haggled in the market square. But the conversations changed. Now people spoke of our provinces, of our laws. A common currency began to circulate, replacing the tangled web of bartered grain, shell, and coin. Schools opened that taught more than one history. Children learned the rivers not just as geography, but as boundaries of shared purpose. Somewhere deep inland, a grandmother who had never seen the sea touched a scrap of dyed cloth and called it her flag. Not because it was perfect, but because it was hers. That's the world we imagined tonight. One where discovery came late and conquest never came at all. where empires hesitated and something else grew in their place. Now let it fade. Let the maps roll back. Let the sea go quiet again. Tomorrow, we'll imagine something new. But for now, close your eyes and sleep well.